So welcome to another T-Rex Talk, and this one I have a very special guest. In previous episodes, I have referred you guys to some legal analysis from the YouTube channel Fudd Busters, and I will link in the show notes to a pretty recent live stream that was as the Bruen decision was handed down by the Supreme Court. Matt, you went through that thing, read it live, had your thoughts unspooling as you went, had a lot of good content. So I'm going to link that to the show notes because that was tremendous. But now that you've kind of digested a little bit, what are some of your thoughts on that particular ruling? And we probably don't have time. It's very late at night for those of you listening. We're not going to get into like super precise legal analysis of exact application here for a bunch of reasons. One, I don't know how. Number two, it's pretty early, but now that you've been sitting on this analysis for a week and mulling it over and thinking about it, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, that's a big question, right? I mean,
yeah,
I've certainly got a lot of thoughts on the matter. And like you said, when the decision came down, I think my live stream was like 2.5 hours. Mm-hmm. And that's just reading the main opinion and processing through all of the implications, right? I was doing it live. I'd never done that before. I'm not usually a live guy. I usually pre-record everything. So it was very interesting how big it was. Y'all have to understand that this is huge. We have not had, everyone always talks about Heller and McDonald and, how great they are. But in terms of legal substance, they left way too much to the lower court's imagination. And thus, in 2008 is when we started really seeing in earnest challenges to various gun control laws. Okay, so to define a standard, right, because that's really important here, that's the scorecard against which you grade a government's action. And that has to be set very clearly. Of course, before the New Deal era, the question was very simple. Does this affect a constitutional right? Yes or no? If yes, government, you cannot do that. But then, of course, with the expansion of our government and, the various New Deal era laws, such as the National Firearms Act, that they started creating these frameworks with which you would analyze government action. There's different levels of scrutiny and different standards. With strict scrutiny, basically the result is the government loses, right? That's like something that would be analyzed under strict scrutiny would be something like, restriction on playing Nickelback over the radio, right? Like that's a clear... It may be a reasonable regulation, right? But it's a clear...
It seems like a good idea at the time, yeah.
Yeah, but it's a clear First Amendment violation. They'd just say, no, you can't do that. And then there's rational basis is on the extreme other end of things, which is basically if you could imagine a reason for the government to do something that is not completely clown shoes insane, it will be held to be a legitimate exercise of the government's power.
Is clown shoes insane a legal term that gets used a lot?
Yes.
Okay, good. Just checking.
Oh, absolutely. At least in my practice. And what's interesting with rational basis is that the government doesn't even need to allege the rational basis. Under rational basis review, the government could allege that it has taken this action, right? And so this would be something like, what are the lower level things that are litigated, like the determination of... I don't believe in the rational basis test is applicable to anything. I think it's completely unconstitutional. But let's say it's something so rote in transcript as your local government deciding to name a street, right? Mm-hmm. And the government says, we named the street this because of the impending alien invasion and because the sky turned purple on that day. The government could say that, and the judge could step in and say, well, they might have named it that to honor the history of the area. And that's a rational basis. And so we're going to uphold the law. So those are the two ends of the extremes. And what they were trying to do is fit Second Amendment challenges somewhere in the between, in this horrible gray area. And what that wound up looking like is in the Ninth Circuit on the West Coast, right? California, Hawaii, and the like. It looked a lot like rational basis, right?
Yeah.
They'd come up with these two-step approaches. Like, does this fall into the Second Amendment? Okay, if it does the government really, really, really want to do it really bad? And what Bruen did here is said, no, the two-step approach is 2 steps too many. Step 1, does it fall under the unqualified command of the Second Amendment, which is if it affects the peaceable bearing of arms? Yes. Okay, if it does, the government must prove that type of regulation is analogous to one that was accepted at certain points in time. And so for the federal government, this would be around the time of the ratification of the Constitution.
Which is fantastic.
Correct.
Because there have been people making historical or bringing up historical examples from extremely recent times.
Right.
And there have been some really, really bad decisions in relatively recent times that do not provide a good defense for for the people. So
Well, you're 100% right there.
being able to take things back that far is tremendous for test case.
It's tremendous for a lot of reasons because you're trying to reflect the original understanding of the Second Amendment, right? It has the scope that it had the day it was enacted, right? The exception there is when it comes to state laws, because the Second Amendment wasn't applicable to the states until the passage of the 14th Amendment. So history up to the post-Civil War era is relevant for state causes. But still, I mean, I was doing a lot of research recently, and I was finding newspaper advertisements for the immediate and ready sale of ready fused hand grenades prepared to throw at no further inconvenience to the buyer until 1909.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, why would you limit this stuff until the age of big government?
Well, it doesn't make any sense. And a lot of people have said, and this has made me very angry when I've watched other people commenting on the decision. They're like, oh, well, you could never get to the NFA because it's dangerous and unusual weapons, and it's been around for a long time. And it's like, dude, the law they overturned in Bruen was passed in 1911.
The Sullivan Act?
The Sullivan Act, yeah, the very obviously and everybody knows anti-Italian law. It was from 1911.
Yeah.
Everything's on the table right now.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Now, I know that phrase, it actually kind of got me thinking. I am not a fan of limiting weapons that are dangerous and unusual. This is how technology goes forward. You come up with something brand new, which is immediately, of course, unusual. And because it's untested, it is also immediately, of course, dangerous. And so this is how you know you're on the right track. So just on its face, this is a poor phrase for excluding certain things.
Well, the lucky thing is that people misunderstand the dangerous and unusual language. Mm-hmm. Go through Bruen. Tell me where it says that any restriction on a dangerous and unusual weapon is valid. It doesn't say that.
Interesting.
Heller doesn't say that either. It's an example. It's an example of a law that they think would, might be the type to pass muster. They're alluding without reference to early regulations of dangerous and unusual weapons. And so it's dangerous and unusual. Mm-hmm. And dangerous can't just mean it's a weapon, right? Because all weapons are dangerous, so it must be particularly dangerous.
It must be something like chlorine gas or something like that, maybe.
Yes. Well, the origin of the phrase dangerous and unusual goes back to early adoptions of the Statute of Northampton, I think it was. And I'm sorry if I bored all your guys' legs shut by this, but I'll get it interesting real quick. Which was they banned the carrying of dangerous and unusual weapons such that would cause public terror, right? They didn't ban the weapons.
And the timing of this law is, we're talking medieval times. We're talking about people going about not armed, but in armor. We're talking about guys on horseback with plate armor and lances. We're talking main battle tanks through the marketplace, not a weapon.
Right. And also, they never banned, I don't see a tradition of banning the weapons. It was carrying around something that was so dangerous and so unusual that its presence would cause terror.
Like a fully armored war horse going through the marketplace, etc.
Exactly. Or a siege engine, right? What I hate is how the government has already tried to use that language to suggest, exactly as you put it, right? If we're to take this language irrationally, the way the government is trying to suggest, it would mean that, I'm a big Walther guy. I like the steel frame handguns. They're really uncommon.
The Q4 is very nice.
Yeah. Well, they're expensive.
Yeah.
Can the government regulate the steel frame handgun just because it's expensive?
They could definitely subpoena the records, find out that Walther hasn't sold quite as many of those stateside as other guns, and jump to that conclusion.
That's what they want this to mean. But that doesn't comport with the logic. And also, here's what I've been alluding to this whole time. That's not the test, as was now very clearly announced in Bruen. Bruen says there is only one way that a law respecting the possession of arms, right, the clear command of the Second Amendment, can fall without the scope of the Second Amendment. And that is if there are historical analogs to that regulation that mean that this type of regulation is deeply rooted in the history and tradition of the United States, right? So it isn't two independent tests. It isn't, oh, well, is it, text, history, and tradition and dangerous and unusual? No. It's the Constitution, the Second Amendment protects it unless the government can prove that this exact type of regulation is analogous to regulations that were existing around the times of the founding, or in the case of state governments, around the time of the Civil War.
So not only does it overturn the Sullivan Act, so now Italians can carry handguns again, like it's actually...
Right? Isn't this great?
Yeah. I mean, Sean Connery isn't like it. The WAPs are going to start bringing guns to gunfights again, and he won't be a fan of it. But other than that, this is tremendous. But it opens the door for a whole bunch of stuff. It opens the door... in fact, it opens the door for cases that were pending to come before the Supreme Court. So my understanding is the Supreme Court has already kicked some cases back for reevaluation now that there is this new ruling which has specific bearing on those cases. And
so and I've seen a lot of people misunderstanding what was happening there. People are saying that the Supreme Court knocked down, right, this, that, or the other thing. Well, yes and no. So what they did was all of these other cases they had on the docket, an assault weapon ban, right? Another carry ban, a magazine ban, like all this other stuff. They did what we call a GVR. So you have to understand the Supreme Court has discretionary review. You apply, you ask the Supreme Court to review your case. They will grant or deny your writ of certiorari is what we call it. So the worst thing that can happen to you, like let's say you lost at the circuit court. You apply to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court just doesn't answer or denies your petition. That means the circuit court ruling is locked in, like you're done. What the court did with these is they grant certiorari. So they granted the case and then summarily vacate the opinion of the lower court and send it back saying, try again, consistent with what we just said in that other case. Mm-hmm. So, and a GVR indicates something to the lower court.
Gotcha. Yeah.
They don't GVR when they think the lower court got it right.
There's a good indication that the lower court got it wrong, but they could get it right now. It doesn't have to be ruled on by the Supreme Court.
Right. The problem was the Supreme Court is most likely to grant your case if it reflects a question that has divided the circuits, if it is something that the government is evading review on, which, as the case with NYSRPA, right? The first time a NYSRPA case was granted, it was granted 2 weeks after I had wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal about how gun-shy and spineless the Supreme Court was. So me and my old boss always like to take credit for that one.
Yeah.
And, New York tried to squeal out of it. And so that meant, to the court, we're getting you. And so right away they came back with another NYSRPA case. But what happens is now they've announced a standard that is applicable to all these cases. Mm-hmm. They don't need to, in their, little lizard lawyer brains, they don't need to apply it now because they have the standard now. Now their dutiful lower courts can apply the standard and come to the correct result. The question is going to be whether, I don't know quite what word to use, but it would be basically mutiny of the lower courts. We've only ever seen this 2 or 3 times in the history of our nation where the lower courts kind of mutiny and refuse to fall in line. But that's what we're going to have to be looking for now.
Well, and it does seem like we've seen hints and whispers of that elsewhere, like the DOJ saying they disagree with a couple of recent Supreme Court decisions, rumblings that the DOD is going to disagree on some of the vaccine stuff. I'm sure that's completely unrelated to the fact that our current Secretary of Defense was on the board of a big health company, still owns a bunch of shares. That's just,
that's impossible.
It's probably something else.
These are good
It's probably
people.
something else.
You can't suggest that these government lizards would ever be lizards. Come on, they're good people. They're like us.
Yeah.
They're regular. They sun themselves on a rock.
So what does mutiny actually look like? You mentioned we've seen this a couple times. When the lower courts refuse to pay attention to something that's been handed down to them by the Supreme Court, what happens?
It's just so rare that I can't tell you what the normal response is. There was one time I remember reading about, because I was very interested in this, where it happened 3 times. And the Supreme Court just kept GVRing the case.
Interesting.
And it kept going back down to the lower court. And in that case, I don't remember what it was. I'm so sorry, guys. This is, just a terrible tease. But I remember reading in that case, they just gave up. The litigants quit appealing it because it was so expensive. Yeah. And so there it was. And what would happen is each time the judge below was clearly very politically motivated, would desperately find some way to distinguish the factors from the Supreme Court's opinion. Mm-hmm. And that's something I'm very afraid of here, because here's how the game is looking to these people who want to restrict our freedoms. The game is, okay, well, it took the Supreme Court 12 years to hear another gun case. And that's even if you count McDonald, because McDonald didn't say anything. McDonald just did the obvious incorporation analysis, which is, yes, states, you too, stupid. So it was 14 years.
Since Heller.
So if you're a, New York Attorney General, or you're a Ninth Circuit panel judge, right? Are you going to feel empowered to say, yeah, no, that's fine, but this is different. This law is different, and so it's still good. Mm-hmm. That's the danger here.
Now, the fact that the New Jersey and California Attorney Generals have told their officials to start issuing permits or to stop applying the May issue requirements, is that just a temporary thing while they scramble to try to find a new bulwark to put up?
Well, for New York, we know it is.
Yeah.
Because we saw that special session, which is completely unprecedented, where they passed a law they didn't even read.
Well, that's not entirely unprecedented. I think we've seen that a few times.
Passing laws they don't read. We see that all the time. What's unusual is them to specially extend their session for a night so that they can zoop something through like that.
It's usually not in response to the Supreme Court. I mean...
Yeah, you usually don't see local governments openly defying the Supreme Court. And there were some cases where they should have. But there's one case where that happened where it was actually good, and it was a response to the Kelo decision, the eminent domain case. All the states were like, nope, we're not letting that happen here. So that was good. Aside from that, this is the first time I've seen such a desperate, flailing, intense, writhing, mutiny against the Supreme Court on the part of all of these state lawmakers.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because we live in really interesting times, and I really appreciate your legal analysis because it's not an area that I pay a huge amount of attention to. I try to pay attention to politics and local politics and media and culture and stuff like that. But the exact same kind of culture war that we see playing out in other areas is now rearing its head in the legal sphere, where there's a bunch of states who are like, we need everyone to get in line behind this big, powerful, omnipotent federal government until they say something we don't want. And then we're going to immediately mutiny. We're going to legalize pot. We're going to do this. We're going to keep cracking down on guns. It's just kind of interesting to watch these quick changes that happen.
I mean, there's a few things to say there. For one, always, and this is something that I learned a long time ago. I used to be, God forgive me for even ever thinking this, but I used to want to go into politics. And so I went to DC, I got a job at a big think tank, and I started rubbing elbows with all these cats. And there was something I learned where you get these, and the term I would call them is suddenly emergent orthodoxies. Mm-hmm. Where just something happens, and now this is the fact. This is a whole new thing, but this is the facts.
Yeah.
And you need to fall in line with the facts, right?
You got to believe the science.
Believe it. Well, of course, that's one obvious example, right?
Donald Trump goes immediately from being a funny guy on the TV to literally Orange Hitler.
Yes.
Like overnight, instantaneous.
And the science, like what the science is, what that emergent orthodoxy is, depends on whether your name is blue or red on the little C-SPAN thing.
Yeah.
And I've just noticed that is permeated far beyond just DC. That ideological cancer has spread to every facet of our life. And it was 20 years ago, the conservatives and many libertarians were saying, oh, this is intersectionality, right? And intersectionality is such a problem because they were referring to the people who say, oh, well, if you're a feminist, you need to also believe in this, that, and the other thing, right?
Yeah. You must adopt the entire package.
You must the whole package. And if you don't have the whole thing, you have failed. But guess what? On the right, they have the same thing.
I think that what it is, for lack of a better word, it's the same kind of laziness that causes us to say, I don't want to take responsibility for this. I'm okay if the government does it.
Right.
And then it's like, well, I don't really want to take responsibility for thinking about every single idea. I'm just, this package has 3 things that I like. I'm just going to be on board with the other 10.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll read it later. I'll pass it now and read it later.
A lot of people who got behind, Mr. Sanders, it was, oh, does he do the pot thing? Oh yeah, he does that. Oh yeah, I support him. It's like, well, what about the other thing? What about the taxes and stuff? They're like, but he does the pot thing, you know?
Yeah.
And that, like, that was super damaging. And also, but here, before I start throwing too much red meat, I will tell you guys, there is one way that we can sit here and we can end the literal majority of gun violence. Like, I'm talking actual violent crime with firearms.
Mm-hmm.
And it's ending the drug war.
Yeah.
The vast majority of these things are related to territorial disputes and other factors that are, you know, outgrowths of the war that was announced, you know, back in the 60s and 70s, and that, you know, the government has been losing for it. Drugs have been winning the war on drugs for all these years. If you end the drug war, that eliminates all the gun crime. Republicans don't want to hear that because they have a bizarre fixation.
Their team started the drug war, so
right.
That's a red thing.
Well, before there was the team, before they switched teams mid-match.
Well, this is the other thing, and not only have the teams changed, but a lot of times these hot button issues will kind of change. Like bodily autonomy,
right,
was a major thing for one team when it relates to abortion, and the exact opposite has to be true for that exact same team when it's about vaccines. So, like,
and firearms,
the level of thought that, you know, we're no longer thinking of things at a deep level. It's just kind of a very superficial team-based tribalism thing that's going on. And that's why you can be deeply in favor of the drug war, even though you don't actually trust any of the federal agencies that are prosecuting it.
Yeah, it's wild. You think about all these different policies that everyone's interested in, right? And how they cannot stand together, and yet they do. Like you were talking about bodily autonomy. Of course, we know. I shudder to even say it, right? Being a male person. I'm not even going to talk about the recent issue of bodily autonomy. But in my advocacy, right? In my advocacy for gun rights of the past nigh on decade, I've been saying for all these years, this is a question of bodily autonomy. This is about my ability to ensure that I cannot be disintegrated by a random felonious actor. It's bodily autonomy. Those very same people look at me like I have a penis growing out of my forehead, right? Like, what do you mean? How is that possibly your bodily autonomy?
Yeah, we decided that this issue is actually attached to deer hunting.
Right. Yeah, or public health, which is the study which originated from turning off poisoned wells, right?
Yeah.
Firearms are a little different from cholera. And let me give you guys a little cheat code. Whenever somebody tells you that, you know, that we need to look at firearms from a public health perspective, you remind them that public health started with cholera outbreaks. And the main distinction between cholera and firearms is that nobody has ever said, well, my grandfather gave me cholera, and we've always had cholera in my family, and we enjoyed it together on the weekends, and so I'd like to keep it.
Yeah, it's an Oregon Trail disease.
We gain utility from firearms. That's why you can buy them at a store, right? There are economic advantages of firearms. That's why all of y'all out there, I know you do it. If you could see my camera, you'd see I do it too. I have a problem. Doesn't matter though.
It's true. You have an excellent collection behind you that I can see on the camera.
Thank you so much. But the thing is, I can buy these because they have value. When's the last time you went to a store and saw cholera on the wall with a price tag on it? So you can't study those two things the same way.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And we have fallen into this problem, getting back to guns and not just philosophical concepts. The strange idea that guns are special. They're unlike other physical items. They're unlike other utilitarian tools. They're somehow special. They're somehow magic. They need to have different rules than other power tools, than other mechanical devices. It's just deeply destructive to the actual honest logical debate to go down that track.
100%. And this is something I learned when, you know, in my DC time. I worked at a really good think tank. I worked at the Cato Institute, and they taught us all this formal logic. And there was one guy there sat us down and he was like, you need to understand where the opponent in your debate is coming from. And if you don't, you need to ask him, why do you think that? And if he can't answer you, walk away. And so the thing that always reminds me of is when people say, and you know what I'm going to say, what statistic do they always bring up?
Oh, the big one, the biggest one, all the deaths.
Gun deaths. Just gun death.
Just all the gun deaths, yeah. But not homicides, not suicides, not different demographics, not accidents. They just put them all in one bucket. Gun death.
Gun death. And then, so every time somebody talks about gun deaths, I say, okay, and this is how I always approach it, because it's always better to catch flies with vinegar than waste money on honey or whatever they say. I always say, I understand that you want to save lives. I too want to save lives. I would like to understand your position. Please tell me, what is the principal distinction between a gun death and some other death? I've yet to get a good answer, right? Because there isn't one. On principle, what is different between a gun death, right? And because again, we're just saying gun death and car death or scalpel death or choking, right?
Some of the weird things that come out of this distinction, this weird magical category that guns sit in, like going after the ability to manufacture your own guns. So the FAA is an insanely regulation-heavy industry. Like it's kind of amazing what the FAA actually controls.
That's because it's run by just Vietnam vets.
And yet, it is easier to build your own airplane with the FAA's permission than make a gun with some of the rules that have been suggested by some of the
right.
people who want to control gun manufacture.
Well, because the FAA has literally said, here's this floor. If your airplane has to be above this for us to even look at it. We don't have that.
Yeah. There's this category called experimental. As long as it's experimental, you build it.
Yep. Have fun.
It's really simple.
Yep.
But guns are these special magical devices that you're allowed to buy them. You're allowed to keep them, but you're not allowed to make them, according to some people. So how obviously that's not going to hold up to some of the scrutiny
under Bruen
that is applied post Bruen.
Absolutely not. Well, if it is applied faithfully.
Yeah.
And especially with people, ATF has a huge hard-on for the polymer 80 stuff. It's just because it's popular.
Yeah.
It's the only reason.
So
it's a victim of its success.
They will argue that it's popular this week, but next week will they argue that it is in fact unusual?
You see, well, they don't have to go there. They have to find an analogous prescription. And guess what? They can't, because, and I looked this up. I'm huge into 3D printing. I'm affiliated with a lot of the guys that develop those things. I've developed a couple of my own 3D printable firearms. It's something that is very, very, very close to my heart. And so I have intensely dug into the law of this issue. 80%ers. There's actually, and I don't even go from 80%ers, right? Us 3D printing guys start with a pool of plastic spaghetti.
Absolutely, yeah.
But 80% has the most historical support. You know how? And since we're not live, I can pull this out, and it's not even a firearm legally anyway. What's the most complicated part on this? I'm holding up a flintlock pistol, a percussion cap pistol.
It is the lock itself, I believe.
The lock. That's right. Everything else is very simple. This is a model of 1837 French Navy pistol, and it's a smoothbore. You know what was common practice in the colonies? They would order buckets of locks, just the locks, from France, the Netherlands, Spain, and the United Kingdom, and build their own smoothbores at home.
The barrels were not that hard to make. Obviously, the wooden parts, the brass, very simple. I have a friend who is a blacksmith, and he has taken some old weapons and restored them. And yeah, it's amazing what you can do with hand tools. Everything except that spring lock mechanism is remarkably easy to do at home.
Which is technically doable.
It is.
Technically doable with hand tools.
It's just an easier thing to get off of the shelf.
Well, because technically, everything you can do with a mill, you can do with a file and patience, right? But it's very hard. And so that's what people would do back then. Just like people do 80%ers now to save money, back then, the time of the founder, they would buy a lock, they'd go to the guy in the neighborhood who did the barrels, and then they'd scratch out a stock, slap it together. This is documented from the colonial era.
There's a similar thing with cannons, because Joe Biden is wrong. You could buy cannons, mm-hmm. But you could also buy, I forget exactly what they're called now, but essentially cannon blanks. So you have the cannon that is cast, but the bore hasn't actually been bored out, and the
right.
touch hole hasn't actually been drilled out. So you essentially have an 80% cannon that you can get.
And the purpose of that was that, and I looked into this a lot. I actually recently did a video on the cannon lie, and I found out the purpose of that was that everything was so non-standard before the cartridge era. Mm-hmm. You would want your bore to match the quote-unquote cartridges, right? The paper packs that your local guy would supply.
Because we all had a cannon guy back then.
No, they did. The towns would.
Yeah.
And so it was easier to get a cannon blank.
Yeah.
And then match it to the stuff your guy got you.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's what they would do. And I found like I said, I was looking through historical newspaper advertisements for the sale of cannons. And like I said, up to 1909, I found newspaper advertisements that would say, any man who owns a ship, dock it here and be outfitted without further inconvenience, 6 to 18 pounder cannons, hand grenades, boarding sabers, and pistols. Right.
Ah, yes.
That sounds quite nice.
And that was New York, I believe.
Well, yeah, I found him in New York. I found him along the East Coast.
Yeah.
You would take your boat and you'd get it fitted.
Very simple, very straightforward, very necessary.
And then also one of my favorite quotes is from, I forgot his name, but he was securing arms for the Vermont militia. And he was bringing in 20,000 muskets and about 30 pieces of field artillery that he had bought himself from the new revolutionary government in France and was shipping it back to the Northeast. And the British seized his ship because they said, well, what would any individual be doing with this many firearms? You are trying to take over Canada. To which he said, on trial in an admiralty court, in America, arms are free products. Any man who has property and wishes to sport with it may turn his lawn into a park of artillery and his house into an armory, for the government in the United States have nothing to fear of an armed populace.
It's a great quote.
Well, that's the history and tradition that the government's going to have to fight with on all this stuff.
Yeah.
And by the way, he got the 20,000 muskets and the field pieces back after he said that.
Yeah, because the British court was like, checks out. That is absolutely true.
You promise you don't want Canada? And he's like, no, it's cold. I don't want that.
So what do you see moving forwards? It is really fun to see that Clarence Thomas has put so much stuff into this ruling. He's obviously looked ahead, and he wants to set a very large precedent, not just overturn the Sullivan Act, but set a very large precedent for stuff moving forward. By the way, I have a theory about that. I have a theory why Clarence Thomas has been relatively quiet for the last 30 years. But now that Joe Biden, his old nemesis, is in the White House.
Oh.
Joe Biden, who led that first witch hunt.
Oh, yeah. Everyone knows he's corn pop.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it wasn't the first Democratic witch hunt against an appointee. Robert Bork was probably the first, really serious one.
Well, yeah, no, he was the first serious one, and that's where the term getting borked came from.
Yeah. And so Clarence Thomas is the second. And for those of you that don't know, Joe Biden was a senator at the time, like he has been for the last 80 or 90 years. And he ran that committee. And
do you remember what he called him?
He called Clarence Thomas horrible, horrible things, and brought all this stuff up with this smile on his face.
Right.
And Clarence Thomas watched him the whole time. And now, 30 years later, we're getting some serious stuff handed down.
Can we say what Biden called him? Because it was really horrible.
I don't know. I mean, well, over and over,
yeah,
and the implying was worse than the stating.
Yeah, well, why don't you beep out the R word?
Yeah,
and people can. He called him a ape, which is foul. Turbo woke people who want to get rid of people who said something weird on Facebook when they were 12, elect as president.
A guy who said that in the Senate.
In the Senate, to one of the first black justices, in any federal court, but especially Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. And you want to call him, and this guy calls him a ape.
Yeah.
So if I were Clarence Thomas, I would have certainly held on to that, but I am an intensely spiteful person.
Clarence Thomas seems nice, but he also seems like he hasn't forgotten anything.
Yeah. I've met him a few times. He's not a normal cat, but his writing's good. So the important thing here, right, was the standard. We didn't have a standard. And so that's why this decision had to be so clear with respect to the standard. Because Heller went on for ages. There was no standard. There was nothing to apply going forward, right? And the lower courts took great advantage of it. And there was this one, one of those Ivy League, pointy head weirdos said, we need to restrict this precedent from below. And then immediately after that article came out, that's when you started seeing the courts below outright saying, oh, well, the Second Amendment doesn't protect AR-15s. It doesn't protect carry outside the home. It doesn't protect all this stuff. And it's like, where'd you get that? Just made it up. And so now that's fixed. Now the text is clear. The command is unqualified. So if it fits in the command, you have to prove that it's related to the, text history and tradition. I disagree. I think it should have gone one step less. I think it should have just been, does it affect the peaceable possession of arms? Yes or no? If yes, go back, right? You can't do it.
So now that we have the standard and things are more clear from the legal perspective, what are some of the ways that we get in trouble? You mentioned one before, which is just the expectation that courts will not pay attention and assume that the Supreme Court will take years and years and years to get back to addressing these issues.
Right.
What are some of the other regulatory things that could pop up from like rogue agencies or so? Although, hey, another Supreme Court decision that just came down, EPA or West Virginia versus EPA.
Yep.
That actually has some significant bearing on certain regulatory.
Not as significant as we wanted.
True, but it is right. A thing that I wasn't really expecting to come down in this little package of stuff over the last couple of weeks.
So for those of y'all who aren't aware, the largest growing area of law, like of the commands that actually bind us as human beings, is not from Congress, it's not from your state government, it's not from your city council. It's from administrative agencies.
Because bureaucrats outnumber everybody.
Yes, and they keep testing the waters, and the courts keep letting them do it. So naturally, what do? I mean, they weren't elected. They didn't have to worry about it. They just keep going and going and going. And so this is literally the largest source of binding components in this country come from people who were never elected and are accountable to nobody. So the biggest problem here was the Chevron decision, which said if the government declares that something is vague, right? Or if a statute is reasonably vague, which guess what? Like all of them are, you will defer to the administrative agency's reading because they are learned and holy. Everybody on the court at the time realized it was a mistake, but they have not outright taken it back. They've been slowly nibbling it back, right? And EPA was a big bite, but it's I think what we need is, hey, lobster clawed bureaucrats, you are entitled to zero deference. Ever, right? That's the only way we can actually fix this. Until then, we're going to see an ATF is, for about 60, 70, 80 years, has been one of the most aggressive ones. Them and the Army Corps of Engineers are the most hyper-aggressive agencies in the federal government. Because guess what? No one tells them no.
I think, and there's a lot of reasons why I think that is. I think that they go after people who don't know that that's an option. And they have a lot of corporate, backing, and it's usually a two-pronged approach. But so I haven't actually read the ruling on EPA. It's a big bite, but it doesn't put enough blocks in place. It doesn't remove enough power.
Well, but I'm an absolutist, right? I want them to straight up be like, you can't do this.
From now on, being a bureaucrat is going to be a felony.
Like I feel like the way the system should be is that a administrative agent's whole job could be done by a lobster, right? Like there's just two big buttons that they can press with their like big hooks, and nothing more nuanced than that. It's just like, is this a square or a circle? And they just go square, circle. That's how it should be if we're going to entrust unelected bureaucrats to anything.
I guess you did spend a lot of time in DC. Yeah.
Yeah, man. It changes you. Or at least it should. If it doesn't change you, you went in there broken.
The problem, this could be a long conversation. Amongst the many problems with the swamp, amongst the fact that it attracts the wrong kind of people and it rewards the wrong kind of behavior, it is actually so hard to get in that even in local politics, like state representatives and state senators, the ones that really want to climb that greasy pole, by the time they actually get to the swamp, I feel like they're pretty far down the path. It is very hard to be a guy like Thomas Massey and continue to want to actually go there and fight the swamp creatures. So it's just very rare when somebody actually does that.
Yeah, and the thing is, you get burnt out.
Yeah.
Hold on 1 second, let me find this. So when you think back even before the VHS revolution, the National Firearms Act was passed in 1934. There was not really even newsletters back then. These guys were having their debates, and they were saying quite openly very horrible things. That now would cause huge uproars.
Yeah, there's a fascinating book. It may be the one you're looking at right now. That's basically all the debate prior to the passage of the NFA Act and the testimony of people like the then NRA president and so forth. And they're like, yeah, we're going to take guns. We're going to take handguns away.
Well, no, yeah. In the testimony of the NFA president, a senator goes, how do you think this affects the right to keep and bear arms under the Constitution? And the NRA president goes, I haven't thought about that.
Yeah.
And that was that. And then here we have Mr. Lewis talking again about the machine gun restrictions in 1934, which is not a ban, it was a tax at that time. I hope the courts will find no doubt on a subject like this, General, but I was curious to know how we escaped that provision in the Constitution. Of course, he's talking about the Second Amendment. We have a representative openly saying, how did we escape the Second Amendment? To which the Attorney General replies, oh, we didn't attempt to escape it. We're dealing with another power, the power of taxation and of regulation under the Interstate Commerce Clause. You see, if we made a statute absolutely forbidding any human being to have a machine gun, you might say there's a constitutional question involved. But when you say we will tax the machine gun, you are easily within the law. And then Mr. Lewis replies, oh, so it's not prohibition, but regulation. Attorney General Cummings, yes, that's the idea. We've studied this very carefully. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if right now we had congressional record, which is distributed to everybody on the internet?
Yeah.
Where they're saying, well, how did we just avoid the First Amendment? How did we get around that?
Yeah. No, it's pretty amazing. And I think there's a bunch of factors there. One, as you mentioned, there isn't really a watchdog media. There isn't really a way for this to get promulgated. The newspapers that were really publishing, they were the mass media of the time, were really focused on some of the Bonnie and Clyde type gang violence that pushed for people actually wanting the NFA in the first place. And it really wasn't, they really weren't doing investigative journalism on corruption in Congress at that time. Right.
Well, and also remember that, so the high point for a handgun ban in terms of public sentiment was 1958, where 60% of Americans wanted an absolute federal ban on handguns. That doesn't change the Constitution, of course, but that's the situation we're looking at, this era, right?
It is interesting. In one sense, we see culturally a lot of downhill slide, things getting worse, government getting bigger, taxes getting more, et cetera, et cetera. But the focus on the Constitution and the conversation about rights, I feel like, is a lot healthier than it was post-New Deal or even post-World War II, when everybody just wanted to be done with that and rest for a bit and didn't want to think about this, didn't want to talk about this, and it just wasn't it wasn't a matter of contention. There was a lot of other stuff that was on people's minds.
Well, what people forget is that the New Deal era put us on the verge of a civil war.
Yeah.
Right? And people were defending, when our current glorious leader said that packing the Supreme Court was not off the table.
Oh, yeah. They had plans, very much like plans that we will probably hear about in the next few months.
Well, the thing about packing the Supreme Court is that, yes, the government has the power to do it, but it's one of those turbo-nuclear civil war-inducing powers that they just tend not to.
Yeah, it's you don't come back from that. That's a crossing the Rubicon, if ever there was one.
Yeah, if there's a good book, it was by one of my old colleagues. He's not quite a colleague. He was never really nice to me, but whatever. He wrote The Dirty Dozen, but he talks about it's these 12 cases that were at that time, right, during that 100 days of the FDR presidency, the first 100 days, where he passed these laws that the public were wild for. They were freaking out. They're like, oh my God, free bread. That's so cool, right?
Free money.
Yeah, and they were all unconstitutional. And the court knew that FDR was going to pack the court if they didn't pass them. And so they just broke the spine of the Constitution. And that's what we are living with today. All of this BS that I've been explaining, these convoluted standards and all this stuff, it is all a result of the 100 days of FDR's presidency. It is literally all directly traceable back to that. It destroyed the legal fabric of our country. And the problem is the judiciary doesn't have the spine to fix it. Because guess what? The first thing you would do if you wanted to restore the Constitution was overturn Lochner. And Lochner was a case, restore Lochner, right? Overturn the case that overturned Lochner. So Lochner was about your right to contract. It was about bakers, right? So there was a New York law saying, bakers can only work X amount of hours. I think it was 6 or 8 or something like that. And they sued saying, we have a right to contract. It's in the Constitution. We have a right to contract for our labor. We can contract whatever we want. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, you're right. And all of the scholars, right, all of your law professors will tell you this was the worst decision in the history of the United States because it enabled the exploitation, right? But guess what? There's a right to contract. It's there. When they overturned Lochner, That was when they started ignoring the commands of the Constitution. That's when they referred to the 9th and 10th Amendments as ink blots, notoriously.
A government that is large enough to tell bakers when they can and cannot work is a government that is large enough to do almost anything.
Yes. And no, just think about that. You're a human being. You know, who makes you wake up in the morning? Like, some of you who are married may have a different answer, right? But for me, it's me. I do it. I can control when I work, right? I have the power to say, no, I won't work any longer. And arguments about exploitation aside, would you rather retain that power or hand it off to a wax figure in Washington, D.C.? And what we've done for about 80 years now is entrust the wax figure with it. And we're feeling the consequences, right? It's as simple as it is.
I thought we were going to get deep into legal analysis, which we have, but I'm really glad that we got down to kind of the root of some of these issues and not just this case law, that case law, the fact that
it's all related.
It's all related. It's inescapable. Yeah. Everything is culturally attached. This idea that politics is downstream of culture is inescapable, and even dusty old boring legal theory comes out of political and cultural decisions or political and cultural trends.
And just imagine, like, the horrible way to think about this is everything that's happening in the Supreme Court right now, everything that's happening in Congress right now, is as a result of the fashion of 1934, 1933. Imagine that, right? Just think about if everything that we had right now was controlled by the fashion of like 2004. So I'm talking like Yu-Gi-Oh cards and like chokers on men, right? That literally is, well, we have to do it this way because of the fashion of the early 1930s.
And it was kind of a trend that a whole bunch of countries around the world, Western nations, were going down this. Government should be bigger. Government is so good and so benevolent. It should just be bigger, and it should just be more powerful, and it should just run some more stuff. And that, a lot of that get really put into place. And then a bunch of people questioned that for some reason after the 1940s. I can't remember exactly what came up that caused people to maybe think that governments weren't always good.
Well,
but some people decided maybe not. But all this legal theory and a lot of these movements are put in place based on this idea that government is benevolent and bureaucrats, that you should always have more of them and they should always be in control of more stuff. A lot of our direction comes out of that idea before it was tested in Germany, before it was disproven in the Soviet Union, before it was tried in China. We've kind of rolled with that in a lot of different ways.
We're stuck with a bizarre mixture of things. The time where, and I'll just tell the audience, right? Take what I'm saying with an entire bottle of Morton salt. I'm a first generation American. I'm born to a Parisian and a Jamaican. So, in my opinion, as somebody who was raised primarily Jamaican in the United States, the greatest culture that the United States ever had was leading up to World War I. Because everyone in Europe who encountered Americans after World War I would always comment about how polite and curious Americans were. We were not full of ourselves. We were strong, but we were intensely respectful and just curious as to how things worked. And that's how you can read so many accounts of people who encountered Americans and they were just like, I can't believe it. All these people came in and they offered me food and like were asking me about my watch and my like truck and stuff. That's what Americans were. Then we get the New Deal era. And immediately after the New Deal era, what do you get? World War II. All of these people who have developed this duty from being too calm and polite become subservient. It becomes illegal to say negative things about your government. And remember, the hyper-progressive hero, FDR, locks Japanese people in cages. No one ever talks about that because we had developed, our curiosity and respect was taken advantage of. And only now, in the past 20 years, are we revisiting the spirit of freedom that animated us. And when you read the warnings that were sent to Britain around the time of the Revolutionary War, it was about the independence, the ruggedness, the devotion, both in faith and to their communities that Americans had. And also, finally, that the prevailing culture in America was to be trained with firearms from the cradle. And there's a great quote, which is that Americans are greater than any adults of their epoch in the world. with a firearm. And that's, I believe we're getting back towards that. I believe that the YouTube revolution has reignited the curiosity in Americans. Because, what do people watch? Like guys like AVE and This Old Tony, like tool channels, restoring things, fixing things, building things, get huge.
Smarter every day, learning stuff.
Yeah. We're revisiting that polite curiosity, and we're discovering, why should I listen? I can just do it myself. At the same time we're doing this, we're getting the government saying you can't collect rainwater, right? So I think it's kind of created a perfect storm. I think that there's a chance that we may restore a great deal of our freedoms, and I think that's good. And I think that Bruen, to tie it all together, finally gives the lower courts the tools that they need to give effect to our freedom. And this isn't, do not fall into the trap of saying that Bruen expanded your rights. It did not. It restored them in the slightest way.
It just reminded people that the Constitution actually meant what it said.
Yes. My old boss back there at Cato, I asked him one day, would you make any amendments to the Constitution if you were drafting it to avoid what we're dealing with right now? He said, oh, absolutely. At the end of every amendment, I would append, and we mean it.
Yeah. Well, that's I think, a fantastic place to end. We got the 4th of July weekend coming up. People will be remembering the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the way that we actually got these freedoms. They came at a tremendous cost, and people thought really, really carefully about the Constitution that they wrote, and they argued about it. We could argue that they made mistakes. They didn't add, and we mean it, and this means you, and various other exclamation points and things to every clause that's in there, every right. But I think that we are tremendously blessed that we have that document, and we're starting to get, some of the cultural changes that you mentioned, but even some of the reminders that the Constitution exists, that the Bill of Rights exists, and that the founders meant it, and we're actually able to secure for those early Americans a lot of opportunities for liberty. So, yeah, I'm encouraged with all the talk that we've had so far about swamp people climbing the greasy pole, the armies of bureaucrats.
Remember, they're lizards.
I'm really optimistic, and I'm really glad that we're going into remembering the Declaration of Independence. On this note, I think we've had some really good Supreme Court decisions. I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking. I do have some off the record stuff that I want to talk to you about sometime in the future, but we can't even hint about that to our viewers because it's just way too cool, just way too interesting for us to delve into. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me on, man. I've always really enjoyed your content, and I'm glad to hang out with you.
Oh, anytime. So
next time we'll have to do the range together.
There's so much stuff that we could do. I'm so pleased to find out that you're into the 3D printing side of things as well, not just from a theoretical perspective, but the engineering and practical side. So
no, I actually just released my first pistol frame, which is it takes Walther P99 PPQ or PDP upper parts. And you print the lower frame, and it takes Glock mags. Ooh. So it combines the best semi-automatic handgun with magazines that exist and are affordable.
You have solved one of the bigger issues that I've run into with Walthers. So you're doing tremendous work.
Yeah, the $50 mags. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you so much for your comments and your insight and the work that you're doing. And we will definitely have some off the record adventures. And thank you so much for listening to the show. Enjoy the 4th of July. Think about what it means. Think about what you can do to continue to learn more about these things and stand up for some of these rights and these freedoms in your communities, and be grateful for what you've been given by your founders. And I think we should be grateful for some of these Supreme Court decisions. Bruen has a lot of potential, and there's a lot of things that we can build on.
Well, and remember, guys, the truth is on our side.
Absolutely.
You get to control the narrative. Go do it.
Fantastic closing words. Thank you so much, Matt. Look forward to our next conversation. You folks listening to the podcast may or may not get to hear it.